Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. It's my privilege to welcome you to today's conference, Ukraine 2016-2017, Progress, Opportunities, and Challenges. Since Maidan, Ukraine has made remarkable progress in undertaking a reform process. Today, we've gathered a range of experts on Ukraine to assess the progress made and discuss what lies ahead. I'm awfully proud of the work that the Atlantic Council has done since 2014, where we've been at the forefront of thinking, strategy, and advocacy regarding Ukraine. We recognized early on that this was a national issue, a regional issue, a European issue, a transatlantic issue, and a global issue that goes to the heart of protection of national sovereignty and the preservation of a principled international order. It's the reason that we've put enormous efforts behind this and behind one of the best teams at the Atlantic Council, Ambassador John Herbst, Alina Polyakova, Geisha Gonzalez, and all the people working for John in our Eurasia Center, Patricio Eurasia Center. We're live streaming the day's events, so welcome also to those joining us remotely. We always have a big crowd live streaming when we have a Ukraine event. We encourage everyone to be part of the discussion by using the hashtag #FutureUkraine and @ACEurasia. I'd also like to extend a special welcome and thanks to our partners at the Razumkov Center for their efforts to make this conference possible. As many of you know, this center is one of Ukraine's leading think tanks, and it is a great honor for us always to work with them. In addition, in the audience today, we have the pleasure of having George Chapivsky with us, one of our top board members and one of the pioneers of our work on Ukraine. It's also my distinct honor always to welcome Senator Rob Portman of Ohio here, who I'll have the pleasure of introducing momentarily. After his opening comments, Minister Natalie Jaresko will speak, the former Minister of Finance, also a long-time friend of the Atlantic Council. And then in the opening session, we'll also have some welcoming remarks from the Ambassador Valery Chali, great friend of ours as well. He'll be leaving early in the day because he is going out to Kansas, Kansas City, where there's a commemoration of America's entry into World War I, where the ambassador will be representing the president of Ukraine. So his comments will be in the opening session rather than in the 10:55 session. Later this afternoon, we'll also have the privilege to hear from Senator Amy Klobuchar, who will provide closing remarks. Both senators who will be speaking today have displayed unshakable support for Ukraine. 3 years after Maidan, Ukraine still faces critical challenges on economic and political reforms that we all know about and lacks the ability to defend itself against Russian aggression. According to official estimates, more than 10,000 people have lost their lives in eastern Ukraine since April 2014. The humanitarian crisis in the east remains dire, and the fighting and harassment of civilians by the Russian-backed separatists continues unabated. And yet, despite all odds, Ukraine has made commendable progress along the reform path it set itself 3 years ago. When you understand the obstacles, it is all the more commendable. Today, we ask you, a very distinguished group of experts, scholars, and leaders, to look back on Ukraine's progress in governance and political reform, examine the ongoing war in Ukraine's east, evaluate Ukraine economy, all while looking to identify the opportunities that lie ahead. In 2014, when few think tanks were focusing on Ukraine, the Atlantic Council founded our Ukraine in Europe initiative within the Dinu Patriciu Eurasia Center. Since then, it has grown into one of the leading Ukraine programs in D.C. The initiative has worked to galvanize international support for an independent Ukraine defined by secure borders and an enfranchised population able to determine its own future. Since 2014, we've made progress toward this goal through publication of reports such as Hiding in Plain Sight. That solicited 138 million media impressions for the hashtag Putin at War, and we had 1.5 million downloads of this report in its Russian version, showing how much interest there was among Russian speakers of knowing what was really going on with Russia and Ukraine. We also partnered with Brookings, the Chicago Council of Global Affairs, to issue the report Preserving Ukraine's Independence, Resisting Russian Aggression, What the United States and NATO Must Do, Calling for Defensive Weapons for Ukraine. That won the University of Pennsylvania's Best Collaborative Think Tank Award. But we're not in this to win awards or get downloads of a report. We're in this to make a positive difference, and with all of you, I think we can continue to do that. We've worked to shine a spotlight on the ongoing crisis in Crimea and Ukraine's east by hosting numerous events. Most recently, we hosted a conference this past fall in the European Parliament with MEPs Anna Bildt and Anna Fotyga on Ukraine's humanitarian crisis, and last month with Congressman Jerry Connolly and Steve Chabot on the anniversary of the illegal annexation of Crimea. Today's conference is a continuation in these efforts to galvanize the transatlantic community to ensure an independent, secure, and prosperous Ukraine. We know this isn't about one report. It isn't about one conference. It's an ongoing initiative that the Atlantic Council will stay with. Leading off today's discussion, I have the honor of welcoming Senator Rob Portman from Ohio. Senator Portman has shown impeccable leadership in supporting Ukraine and its people. He is the founder and co-chair of the Senate Ukraine Caucus and a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committees. He's one of the most impressive thinkers and actors on international policy issues in America today. Former U.S. Trade Representative who acted during his time in office to reduce barriers on exports, leveling the playing field for farmers, workers, and service providers. It's not the first time, Senator, that we've had you at the Council. Last year, you and your colleague, Senator Chris Murphy, launched here your Countering Disinformation and Propaganda Act, an effort designed to help American allies counter foreign government propaganda from Russia, China, and other nations. The act was announced at the Atlantic Council on March 16, 2016, shortly after it was introduced on the Senate floor. Most recently, at the end of last month, Senator Portman introduced a resolution on behalf of Ohio's Ukrainian community condemning illegal Russian aggression in Ukraine and urging the U.S. President to maintain sanctions on Russia as long as these actions continue. Senator, we thank you for your leadership, and we turn the floor to you.
Fred, thanks very much. It is great to be back, and Fred is correct, both about the Atlantic Council's key role with regard to Ukraine, but also the fact that it was about a year ago, almost exactly, that I was here to announce our disinformation legislation, which is now law, by the way. And already the State Department is putting in place the Global Engagement Center that it calls for. And I want to thank Fred personally and the Atlantic Council for their work with us. Senator Murphy and I are appreciative of the effort that went into that. It's not typical these days that there is anything much good getting done on a bipartisan basis in Washington. And more importantly, it's not typical that something would be announced and then enacted into law within such a short space of time. It was enacted into law late last year. So we thank you, Fred, for that work and, of course, what you do every day to strengthen the relationship between the United States and our allies in Europe, the broader focus of the Atlantic Council. A lot has happened in that last year since I was here, and I think suffice it to say that we probably could have fit everybody in Washington, D.C. who was focused on the information war, particularly the threat from Russia, in this one room. And today, this is a topic that, of course, is on the front pages of the newspapers and on the broadcast news constantly. So things have changed. Our legislation is now law, and that gives us a chance to be able to better organize the U.S. government response to that information war. No one understands the consequences of Russia's information war better, of course, than the people of Ukraine. And I've learned that firsthand during my visits to Ukraine. I've also learned that in our work we're doing with the Ukraine Caucus in Washington here, also on the Foreign Relations Committee where I now sit. And I was not on the Foreign Relations Committee a year ago, and we've already had a couple of hearings that focus on this issue. I've also had the opportunity to meet, as Fred indicated, with our Ukrainian community in Ohio. We have a strong Ukrainian-American connection through Ohio, and they've helped to keep me informed of what's going on in Ukraine. This morning I've been asked to talk a little about that, what's happening in Ukraine, what my perspective is on Ukraine, and I'm happy to do that. I think although great challenges remain, we have made progress even in the last year and certainly in the last several years. I'm going to talk about ways I think the United States and its allies can help to encourage more progress. I would say that the good news is that 3 years after Russia annexed Crimea and 25 years since Ukraine regained its independence, I believe Ukraine has come closer to realizing what I would consider the more open and democratic future that so many Ukrainians fought for on the Maidan. And it has done so in the face of direct military aggression from Russia and its proxies in the eastern part of Ukraine, severe economic and social pressures, and persistent Russian information operations designed to subvert the authority of the Ukrainian government, undermine faith in Ukraine's institutions, demoralize the Ukrainian people, and persuade the West, frankly, that Ukraine is a failed state, not worth the effort to prop up. So progress has been made, and it has been made in the face of real challenges. When we talk about Ukraine's fight to defend itself and pursue the future the Ukrainian people called for in the Maidan, I think we're essentially talking about two, what I would consider distinct but probably related conflicts. The first is the external conflict, which we've talked about a lot here at the Atlantic Council, and that's the ongoing political, economic, military, and information aspects of Ukraine's fight to defend itself. That's ongoing. I met with Ambassador Chali, who's here with us this morning. I think we'll hear from in a moment on this very topic. A couple of weeks ago, we discussed some of the issues that are going on today in Ukraine in some detail, the daily human cost as the fighting in the east of Ukraine continues. By the way, despite the Minsk ceasefire agreements, Russia continues to arm, train, equip, organize, and lead separatist forces in eastern Ukraine, while thousands of Russian troops are currently stationed in the Crimea and along the border. Some have said it's a frozen conflict. I don't think, Ambassador Chali, you would agree that the conflict is frozen. Sadly, it's not frozen. I don't think it's ever been frozen. I don't think it will end until something happens to alter Russia's calculation about whether continuing to fuel this conflict is worth the price. In the United States Senate, at least, we've been able to build a pretty durable bipartisan consensus on support for Ukraine. Even in today's highly charged partisan atmosphere I mentioned earlier, we've been able to keep ourselves focused on trying to be helpful to Ukraine. These bipartisan efforts, fostered by the Senate Ukraine Caucus, which Senator Durbin and I started about 2 years ago, key members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senate Armed Services Committee, and others continue to generate new initiatives. In fact, just last week, Senator Sherrod Brown and I introduced a bipartisan resolution commemorating the 3-year anniversary of the annexation of Crimea and reaffirming U.S. support for Ukraine and efforts to hold Russia accountable for its violations of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. So there is a bipartisan consensus still on this issue, which we must hold. There's also a bipartisan agreement on the policy tools the U.S. should utilize as part of its comprehensive U.S. strategy to support Ukraine, deter future aggression against our allies and interests, and uphold the fundamental principles of the U.S.-led international system that Russia's actions ultimately threaten. These policies include continued enforcement of joint U.S.-EU sanctions. Yesterday we had the opportunity to hear from the ambassador from the EU and the Foreign Relations Committee, and we talked about the fact that the 6-month extension of the sanctions is a positive thing, that the EU is incredibly important ally in this. We also have continued increased discussion of both lethal and non-lethal military assistance to Ukraine. I believe it's fair to say that there is a bipartisan majority in the United States Congress that supports not just non-lethal but also lethal assistance so Ukraine can better defend itself. During the confirmation process, Secretary Tillerson expressed his agreement with that approach, by the way, and that's something that you continue to hear the administration talk about. We need to move forward with that, in my view. In the Congress, we're talking about an enhanced U.S. military presence in the region, more robust and coordinated efforts to counter Russian propaganda and disinformation in Ukraine, and for that matter throughout Europe, including with the elections in France and Germany upcoming, and a unity of action between the U.S. and the EU on holding Russia accountable for its violations of the Minsk agreements, the Budapest Memorandum for that matter, and other international norms and agreements. So I think there is a general bipartisan agreement on the policy tools that the U.S. should be utilizing. The second conflict I want to mention in Ukraine is the internal struggle. So we talked about the external side. We'll hear much more about that today. There's also an internal struggle to fulfill the promise of the Maidan. And finally, break free of the corruption, lack of accountability, and mismanagement that has hamstrung previous Ukrainian efforts to chart an independent, democratic, and pro-Western path. This may ultimately be as hard to win as the external conflict, but it's crucial to Ukraine's long-term success. Both are. I believe that corruption and weak institutions fuel the spread of Russian influence more than virtually anything else, both in Ukraine and throughout the world. Thus, the political and economic reforms are not just key to achieving greater transparency and accountability in government, which is so important, they're also national security priorities. The Ukrainian government, with the help of Ukraine's vibrant civil society, has made tremendous strides in tackling 25 years of cronyism, waste, fraud, and abuse throughout the government. For example, the Ukrainian government's successful management of the temporary nationalization of Privat Bank, Ukraine's largest private bank, is an underappreciated success story in my view. A better-known example is the joint U.S.-Ukrainian effort to reform the police and border guard service. The successful introduction of roughly 16,000 new patrol police across Ukraine, trained by Ukrainian and American instructors, is an example of that. By the way, this includes instructors from the Dayton, Ohio Police Department, and I'm very proud of them and the efforts that they have made. This has been a highly visible and powerful message of progress in building the new Ukraine. The U.S. and NATO Train and Equip program has helped produce real improvements in the tactical proficiency of Ukrainian forces, as evidenced by successful recent combat actions against Russian-led separatist forces, such as in the clashes in Avdiivka at the end of January. Despite these successes, Ukraine continues to face challenges implementing difficult structural reforms. Now, I want to highlight two key areas where I think continued engagement from Ukraine and sustained assistance by its Western partners, including here at the Atlantic Council, will be particularly important. The first is the defense institutional reforms necessary to sustain the gains Ukraine's military has made over the long term and complete its transformation into a modern, professional fighting force aligned with NATO standards and procedures. Under Senator McCain's leadership, I have helped draft U.S. security assistance for Ukraine as part of the National Annual Defense Authorization Bill for the past 2 years. And the importance of defense institution building reforms such as improved logistics and sustainment capabilities will continue to be a focus because it's so important. For the first time, last year's military assistance package conditioned half of U.S. military assistance on successful progress toward implementing key defense reforms, such as civilian control of the military, greater parliamentary oversight, and budget and procurement transparency and accountability. The other critical reform priority I wanted to mention is the need for tangible, visible, and high-impact results from Ukraine's judicial reforms and anti-corruption initiatives. Ukraine and the United States have partnered on a number of projects to help reform the prosecutor's general office and judicial system and have helped implement promising new initiatives like the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. I believe that successful prosecutions of corrupt high-level officials or former officials or businessmen will generate meaningful momentum for President Poroshenko's reform agenda and demonstrate Ukraine's commitment to real and lasting reforms. After the Obama administration's somewhat belated and reactive response to Russia's aggression in Ukraine and broader reluctance to assume America's traditional leadership role in confronting and deterring security challenges around the world, not just in Ukraine, I know that many of you are anxious or curious to see what new approach the Trump administration might take to Ukraine, Russia, and America's role in the world. I am curious also. Let me just take a brief moment to share a few quick thoughts on how we might look at the road ahead. In my view, the new administration represents an opportunity, and it's an opportunity for a kind of real reset, one that renews America's commitment to our European allies, including Ukraine, and rededicates American foreign policy to upholding the shared interests and values that underpin the U.S.-led international system, upon which our national security and economic prosperity absolutely depends. The President's got a really impressive national security team, in my view. This includes, of course, professionals like Secretary Mattis, Secretary Tillerson, Lieutenant General McMaster, Secretary Kelly, the UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, and even the Atlantic Council's very own, Fred. To have Governor John Huntsman as our next ambassador to Russia is a very good sign, in my view. I think these are the kind of people you would want to have developing and executing the national security strategy we need, particularly as it relates to Ukraine. Some of you may know this, but General McMaster literally led the Army's Lessons Learned project on Russia's new generation war doctrine and its application in Ukraine. So he's very familiar with the situation in Ukraine. In addressing a daunting array of security challenges around the world, one of America's enduring advantages over our adversaries is our alliances around the world. It truly is incredible. There is no nation in history that's ever been able to count on such a vast network of allies and partners around the world willing to go to war alongside U.S. forces, voluntarily open their markets to U.S. trade and investment, actively solicit our input and involvement in working toward shared goals, and agree to uphold shared interests, norms, and values. This is a tremendous strength that we have. To be clear, all of our partner nations need to do their part in upholding the shared burden that we have. I do believe it's unacceptable that only 5 of our 28 NATO member states can be said to meet the required 2% GDP threshold for defense spending, as an example. Yet, at the end of the day, we've got to remember the pivotal role these nations play in helping us to confront an increasingly dangerous, complex, and insecure world, a task we would otherwise be left to do alone. We have to build our alliances. The values and interests we share are the glue that keeps this valuable network of friends and allies together. Thus, America is ultimately strongest when its allies are strong too. In my view, restoring American strength and leadership goes hand in hand with renewing America's longstanding commitment to its allies and willingness to assume a leadership role in addressing shared challenges. To conclude, despite the uncertainties and risks of today's increasingly complicated strategic landscape, I remain fundamentally optimistic about Ukraine's prospects and the durability of the U.S. support for Ukraine in Congress. The United States and its allies must redouble their political, economic, and military support for Ukraine as part of a broader U.S.-led regional engagement strategy. Ukraine should also continue to make progress on implementing its ambitious reform agenda, as I noted today, and its friends in the West should help empower Ukrainian reformers by using its assistance to incentivize the fulfillment of some of these key reform objectives we talked about. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk again about Ukraine today, and again, Fred, thank you for your continued personal engagement and support, and the Atlantic Council's tremendous support for our disinformation legislation and our ongoing efforts to help Ukraine. Fred mentioned that we have among us a number of distinguished guests. One I now have the privilege of introducing, one of the best known of the Ukrainian reformers, someone who shares transatlantic values, someone who has served both the government of the United States and the Ukrainian government, former Ukrainian Finance Minister Natalia Jaresko. Having met with her during her tenure as Finance Minister, I can attest to the valuable role she played in guiding policies and developing trust between President Poroshenko's new government and senior U.S. officials and members of Congress. By the way, she was always very frank in her discussions, which I always appreciate. She was important in developing that trust between senior U.S. officials and members of Congress both, many of whom were excited about the changes happening in Ukraine, but weren't quite sure what to make of the post-Maidan Ukraine or its new government. I'm really pleased she's joining us today and look forward to hearing her perspective. Thanks again for inviting me to speak today, Fred, and we'll now turn to Minister Jaresko.
Not today. Thank you very much, Mr. Senator. My thanks to the Atlantic Council, to the Razumkov Center, and to all of you today for coming to focus on a subject near and dear to my heart, and I assume to many of yours. I think today what's interesting is finally the Western democracies are waking up to the efforts of the Kremlin to destroy, or at least disrupt, our liberal democracies. One headline after another: United States, France, Brexit, Germany. Ukraine has been at the forefront of this, as the Senator said, this hybrid war, for over 3 years. And many thought to themselves, this situation in Ukraine, this is just part of Russia's sphere of interests. This is sphere of interest politics, and many here in Washington and in other capitals throughout the world questioned whether or not really we should be involved in something that might be, in fact, in the sphere of interests of Russia. we wondered, some wondered, many questioned whether it was worth denying the Kremlin's desire to rebuild its empire, its sphere. But today, we see that Ukraine is simply uniquely close on the very front of the battleground globally. It is not about the Kremlin's sphere of interest. It is not about the Kremlin rebuilding its empire. Or at a bare minimum, it is not only those issues. The world believed after the Cold War that the opposition to our liberal democracies, to our post-World War II order, had been lost, that the communist system fell, and therefore we won. Our sense of post-World War II order, our liberal democracies, our values and freedoms were those that won over those of the ill-fated communist system. And we now see that in its place, something else grew. An autocratic, oligarchic system that fears and despises our system of freedoms and values equally, perhaps, to the Kremlin then, and fights this war today globally to destroy the transatlantic partnership, the Europe whole and free, and our post-World War II order. And now that we have come to understand globally the depth of the Kremlin's hatred of our values and their willingness to use all the tools at their disposal to disrupt our way of life, we must act in a concerted fashion to defend our ideas and our way of life. And Ukraine is the perfect case, the perfect place in which to defend this. I used to say that the reforms in Ukraine represented a glass that was half full. I've come to believe that it's more than half full. It's more than half full because our civil society in Ukraine is demanding, engaged, and unwilling to allow for reversal. It's true that that half-full glass, or more than half-full glass, represents more economic and anti-corruption reforms than were instituted during the previous 20 years of our governance. But it's been repeated over and over, and it's important to note time and time again what we did in that half-full glass, because against many of the accusations, and the Senator mentioned this, in 2014, people believed Ukraine was a failed state. That with the largest standing Europe attacking, with a financial crisis that in effect meant there was no funding, debt that was going to lead to a disruptive default, that Ukraine could not continue as an independent state. And in fact, I would argue that we showed that to be completely and entirely false. We returned representative democracy to Ukraine through a series of elections at every single level. We rebuilt our military and we stopped the aggressor in his tracks. We turned around our fiscal policy, throwing away fiscal deficits and public spending patterns from the previous 20 years. We stopped having arrears in wages to our citizens, in pensions to our citizens, practices that had gone on from day one in independent Ukraine. We built an independent central bank. We rebuilt our central bank reserves. We calmed our currency. We cleaned up a weak and fragmented banking system. We began serious gas market reform, eliminating corruption of the middlemen that had been siphoning off billions of dollars each year, eliminating rent-seeking behavior and different prices in the market, introducing competition into the actual sale of gas, introducing independent board members into our state oil and gas company, auditing that state oil and gas company for the first time in its history. And as a result, we haven't had to purchase Russian gas directly from Gazprom for over 500 days. We restructured our sovereign debt without a dismal and messy default. And we built and financed and staffed these new anti-corruption institutions. We adopted a very long overdue constitutional judicial reform in October of last year. Yes, all that and more, all that with, at the same time, 10,000 dead, 20,000 wounded, 1.9 million internally displaced people. And even today, even yesterday and the day before, during our ceasefire, Ukrainian citizens are dying at the front to protect our freedoms. So could a failed state have accomplished all of that in the last 3 years? Absolutely not. Could a failed state have done all that and dedicate 5% of its GDP to defense and security? Not 2%, the NATO numbers, 5%. A failed state could not have done that. So no, the glass is half full simply by recitation of what has been done today. But it's more than half full, I return, because in Ukraine today there is a civil society, not Western governments, not the IMF, not an enlightened elite, and not a benevolent autocrat dictating the direction of Ukraine's reforms. It is civil society that's dictating the direction of Ukraine's reforms. I think it's also important to remember that Ukraine comes to this global environment, comes to Washington and every other capital, not only as a country with needs and requests for support, but it comes as a member of a global society and a major contributor. Ukraine can help make America great again. Number one, Ukraine is probably one of the largest markets for American goods and services that is completely not visible in the streets of Ukraine. So whether you're an exporter of U.S. automobiles or U.S. agricultural equipment, 35 million people, an incredibly robust agricultural economy, and they are not fully satisfied. They're not fully using their quota of American goods and services. Ukraine's economic growth will result in very positive things for many American sectors. Aside from that, Ukraine is a partner in global security, has been, is, and will be. Yes, it began with nuclear deproliferation or non-proliferation, giving up its nuclear weapons to make the world a safer place, not just Ukraine, the world a safer place. But it continued in terms of the Ukrainian participation in coalition of the willing. It continued with Ukraine's participation in U.S. peacekeeping, and it continues to this day in Ukraine's fight against the Kremlin on the border of Europe. Ukraine could also be a net contributor and a potential strategic partner in today's cybersecurity issues. Ukraine ought to be brought into that as a net contributor. So my argument is not only is the glass half full in Ukraine, it's more than half full. And not only is Ukraine a country that demands and is worthy of continued support at a time when the Kremlin, Ukrainian vested interests aided by irresponsible populists fight the reforms that have been conducted to date, fight the future of other reforms that are needed to fill that glass to the top and ensure that first half are irreversible. It is now more than ever the time to double down on support for this very, very strategic country and this extraordinarily successful situation. Aid and support the reformers, finance and guide the reforms, support civil society, support the Ukrainian military, support and invest in the Ukrainian people, in the Ukrainian medical institutions, medical hospitals, schools, education, that which will make Ukrainians even stronger in their fight and in their role to be a partner in this post-World War II liberal order. I fear that today many of our Western partners don't have any tools in their hands. And I'm all for conditionality, so mind you, I'm not suggesting anything comes free. Nothing comes free in the world. But I fear that many of our partners have no longer tools available. After the Maidan, the world came to us with support. The United States provided several $billion of credit guarantees. The European Union provided 1.8 billion euro in macro-financial support. The World Bank came up with development funding. All of that, or most of it with one small exception, has been utilized. There's nothing else behind that. So today what we have is a situation where more than ever, Ukraine has shown its capacity to use these funds, its capacity and desire to reform, and the fact that this reform desire comes from the bottom up, and the West does not have the tools with which to continue helping Ukraine. And so I urge Western governments to come up with those tools and come up with them quickly, because the reformers need those tools to fight those vested interests, to fight those Kremlin interests, and to fight those who want to reverse these reforms. Together, Ukraine and the Western democracies can assure that Ukraine is the successful bulwark of our successful, valuable post-World War II liberal order. Thank you. And It's my great honor to introduce right now the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, Mr. Ambassador Valery Chali.
Good morning, Senator Portman, members of Ukrainian Parliament, President Kempe, distinguished audience. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here and, to make in such an important event, to make open remarks. Let me begin with thanking to Atlantic Council team, President Kempe, Ambassador Herbst, Alina Polikova, Geisha Gonzalez, for very intense Ukrainian agenda with this your activities. And it's helped us a lot to understand what's happened in this important part of the world. Why it's Ukraine matter, why it's Europe matter. Nowadays we see the new threats in North Korea with new launch of missile. We see using the chemical weapons in Syria. But please not forget that World War I and World War II began in Europe. I see Europe is a very important part for the 21st century. So our idea how to bring closer vision for the future from the United States, Western Alliance, and Ukraine. Definitely we need Russia as a reliable, predictable partner in the future, not a threat. For Ukraine, it's even more challengeable now, it's even our last meetings or last conferences. Again, because last week we lose 9 officers and soldiers. A week before that, 6. Plenty wounded. So we see that Russia brought more and more troops to our borders. And that's a threat that exists now, not in the future. So we need to make response now. Do we have such a common vision how we will develop Europe and we will develop security in Europe? Frankly, among ambassadors, we discussed months ago some concern about lack of vision here in the United States. Now we are even more optimistic because we see there's no great challenges, not great differences for the previous position. The decision by President Trump to have the first international visit to Brussels to realize NATO headquarters is a good decision. Our level of cooperation between Ukraine and United States, for me as ambassador, is pretty satisfied of that because we had a phone conversation among presidents, we had a meeting with Vice President Pence, Ministers of Foreign Affairs. We have a very intensive agenda. But what they need? Substance. And I appreciate that my friends make opening remarks, very substantial opening remarks. And I agree completely. So 2 important tasks for Ukraine for respond to these challenges. Internal, facilitate the program of reforms because it's the only opportunity to demonstrate ability of Ukraine not only survive but develop in the future. And still, not forget, please, we are in a state of war. We can name it anti-terrorist operation, something else, but we are in a state of war with our neighbor. That's a challenge and situation which we never before think about. That's why I think it's the right time to discuss many issues, and I'm pleasure also and honor to share to speak together with my colleagues in the Razumkov Center when we did analysis for a long time. And I remember when we began project US-Ukraine Policy Dialogue with the Atlantic Council, years before. We even can't predict that we will discuss in the beginning of the 21st century wars in the world. We need peace, not war. What we should do now, be strong enough to stop any of the country, any attempts to break international order, what we see now. So I'm satisfied that with bipartisan support of American Congress and new piece of legislation, we really appreciate for the new support 150 million for military technical cooperation. But what's important, not decrease or not cut this international activity and assistance for the new administration, because from my point of view, it could be a great mistake. And we believe that this will continue to involve all the United States and the leadership, keeping leadership role in the different part of the world. It's simply to save money of taxpayers of America in the future. And we need you as friends and supporters of Ukraine now. Believe me, and I know that many of you contribute a lot of that. In the future, in the very next future, Ukraine will be a very active contributor and supporter of not only the United States and our Western alliance, but all the world with people of goodwill. And finally, not less important, you will see new initiative in the very next months to maintain a peace or bring peace in Ukraine. But I, as ambassador of Ukraine, want to make the official statement that any decision with situation in Ukraine, without decision by Ukrainian people, so-called compromises with Russia, to giving up Crimea, to decide with like a frozen conflict in Donbass, we will not allow implement that. The only option for restore peace, withdraw Russian troops. We have all evidences of presence of Russian troops on our territory. Closing border, release hostages, and after that we can go for political decision. Thank you very much for your attention.
So good morning. My name is Alina Polyakova. I'm the Director of Research for Europe and Eurasia here at the Atlantic Council. And I just once again want to thank Senator Portman, Minister Jaresko, and Ambassador Chali for their opening remarks to this full-day conference focusing on Ukraine. And of course, a big thanks to our partners from Kiev, the Razumkov Center, which is the premier research institute in Ukraine, do a lot of good analytical work on tracking what has been happening on the side of reforms. I just want to remind everybody that some of our panelists will be speaking Ukrainian, some will be speaking English. All of you should have headphones. If you do not, we can get you some. Please turn those on if you don't speak one of those languages. It's going to be number 1 for English and number 2 for simultaneous Ukrainian translation. So it's really my pleasure to introduce a distinguished panel today to talk about reforms in civil society and government today. To my immediate left is Mr. Pavlo Pinzenik, who is the deputy head of the People's Front Party Political Council. And he is a member of the Parliamentary Committee on Rules and Procedures, so very well positioned to give us a detailed account of the recent reforms on that front. And to his left is, of course, somebody who's seen here before, who has been a great supporter of encouraging reforms in Ukraine, particularly in civil society, Ms. Alexa Tropivsky, who's the executive director of the American Center for a European Ukraine. She was a longtime journalist before that, and has spent quite a bit of time in Ukraine herself in recent years. So thank you, Alexa, for being here with us.
Thank you.
And then to Alexa's left, we have Dr. Yuri Yakimenko, who is the Deputy Director General and Director of Political and Legal Programs in the Razumkov Center, our partner in this conference today. Dr. Yakimenko holds a PhD in political science from the National Academy of Sciences Institute of Philosophy, and we're delighted to have him with us here today. And then last, but certainly not least, we have Professor Victor Musiyaka, excuse me. It's sometimes hard to read English when it's supposed to be Ukrainian. He's a research fellow with the Razumkov Center and has served as a member of parliament of the Verkhovna Rada from 2002 to 2006, another tumultuous point in Ukraine's history. So thank you for joining us here today. So to begin, we're just going to have a discussion for the next 40 minutes, and I would like to bring in our audience as well to ask a few questions. So just as a reminder, you have translation. So I'd like to begin, Yuri, with you, if I can.
Yeah.
Many have said, and Senator Portman said this again in his remarks this morning, that Ukraine is fighting two wars. One, a military war in the Donbass against Russian aggression, and then a second internal war against corruption within Ukraine itself. Since the Maidan Revolution of Dignity, the government has taken many significant steps to introduce more transparency. Two specific reforms that are often discussed and lauded here in the West is the e-procurement system, which makes transparent and accountable all government procurements. It's a huge accomplishment that many Western countries don't have. And of course, the e-declaration system that requires government officials to declare their assets and is accessible to anyone for view. These initiatives, I think, have been shown as a sign of progress. We're often talking about them. But in your view, have they actually produced any significant change when it comes to this internal battle against corruption?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Really, we are in a state of two wars. But I would like to say that the second war is not only against corruption, it's only a part of this war. It's a part of war, it's a war for reforms. It's a war for our new future. And probably our success in this war is the most important non-military response to Russian aggression. Of course, fighting corruption is a core component of this war. And those measures that you have mentioned already are really very important because we started to clean up the system of governance, and we started from the level of political corruption, first of all. And in this case, especially e-declaration and transparency of incomes and assets of politicians, of civil servants, of top level, of judicial corpus, of prosecutors, are very important for society. Because it's very powerful anti-corruption tool. The possibility to compare is very important. Really, you mentioned that now our politicians and state servants probably the most transparent in the world. This is the other side of this reform, and there are some other implications of that. But I would like to mention another very important step. It's the introduction of state financing of political parties in Ukraine, because parties play a very important role in our political system, then form the parliamentary coalitions, then form the government. And together with this introduction of state finance of political parties, there are serious measures undertaken to make clear party finance, electoral campaigns, party campaigns, so on and so forth. And I think altogether those steps are very important in fighting corruption on the political level, and then going from the top to the bottom to clean up the other spheres of society from corruption.
So in your view, is this the right path forward, the top-down approach? Is that, so should change begin at the top and then trickle down, or are there other ways that we can think about this war?
I think it's really right approach because people taking the example of behavior from the political elite, from governmental elite, from elite in other spheres. And if those elites exemplify the corruption approach, then it deeply spread in society. So to start with society, it's really necessary to work also with society. But I think to start with the top level, it's for the beginning, it's the right approach. Correct.
So just to follow up on that, we'll, I think, be talking about this topic the entire time of the panel. But we've seen also some, I think, concerning public opinions in Ukraine. Some polls have shown that many Ukrainians think that corruption is actually getting worse, and if not getting worse, that's not getting better. Why do you think that despite these, this progress, these very important changes, people still feel this way, your average Ukrainian?
Basically, questions that people got worse in their average living doesn't depend directly from the level of corruption. Because probably it might be said that it's a result of the social price of reforms. Because we grow the prices for gas, we grow the prices for housing halls, we have a very high level of inflation that is not because of corruption, that because of war, the war spending, and so on and so forth. We have a set of social and economic factors that moved people to feel worse than before. And another story is that during the Maidan there was a huge level of people's expectations of that Maidan will immediately drive them to reforms to the better living. It happens in the other way, and so the level of disappointment is also very, very high now. But at least on the results of opinion polls, we observe that there are no more corruption than before when people answer directly on the questions of pollsters. So the level is the same, it's not bigger. But another part of the story is that this is a really problem that is its importance in media, and the media attention is also feels that the people start talking more about that. This is really a societal problem, but in factual level, it's I couldn't say that it is more than before.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Victor, if I could ask you to add to this conversation. So continuing to talk about anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine, the NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Agency that was set up, has been another hailed achievement for Ukraine. But again, recently we have seen that the NABU has come under a lot of political pressure when carrying out its investigations. In your view, has this particular new agency been effective? And if so, how has it been effective?
I think that I apologize. I'm going to speak in Ukrainian. You know, everybody wants to get everything, all the results from NABU's operations. NABU was created in 2015, and I had a direct link to the competition when the director of NABU was selected. We had 70 candidates, and after all, we have now NABU, which is led by Director Pansitnik, and we also created special anti-corruption prosecutor's office, and we also needed to change constitution in the last year. The prosecutor's office has completely different goal. It does not have the general supervision, and it has the right to raise charges against judges. And this is also in competences of the special anti-corruption prosecutor, and it can also has authority to conduct follow-up investigation. So everything what is taking place right now in the area of the NABU activities is under very special, literally under microscope of the society. Everybody expects that somebody should be, as they say, to end up in jail, particularly those who are from the senior government official. For the time when NABU exists, it works for a little bit more than a year. What do you mean? What I mean is when I say operates, it should have about 700 people, personnel, out of them 200 investigators. And this is only shaping of this agency. And at the same time, we have investigation. And one should keep in mind that the work of this NABU, when everybody keeps an eye on how it works, and I should tell you that this pressure, this social pressure, the attention, the focus from the media on the NABU's activities results that it causes leaks because they need to provide proofs that they have achieved something, and to answer, let's say, certain requests from those who are under investigation. On the other hand, the representatives of the civil society who work in the area of the fighting corruption also pressure this body. So wherever they are, but now they began to work on banking system. They should conduct the investigation quietly, without any sensationalism. I expect there we are going to have good results. That's why I'm saying that the outlook for the NABU as the anti-corruption agency it still is taking shape of its system, of this body, of this agency. Funding is going to be fully provided, and besides, we are going to have other agencies which work with it. We have National Agency of Fighting Corruptions and Prevention of Corruption. We also are about to end the creation of the International Investigation Agency. And it's going to be not only within the framework of NABU, but on the entire structure of the government to fight corruption. That's one where we are talking about NABU. We need to keep in mind this whole gamut. And I'm not going to say more. I expect that maybe there are going to be more questions. And also because it is linked to the courts, because the results are always going to be in the courts. And that's why it is specifically linked to the creation of anti-corruption court. Maybe somebody's going to ask me a question, and then I'm going to answer.
Much of the media focus has been on the NABU. It is part of a bigger infrastructure that has been developed and is developing in Ukraine, and we're only seeing the beginnings of that infrastructure and how it will work. But I do want to follow up because, again, here in the United States and the Western countries, we've also seen a lot of criticism of the General Prosecutor's Office, which is supposed to play the key independent function in prosecuting corruption cases specifically. And the problem in Ukraine is that the General Prosecutor has not been seen until very recently as actually an independent agent of the Ukrainian people and not beholden to special interests. The current General Prosecutor, Lutsenko, was just appointed last year in May, so he hasn't been in the job for even a year yet. Has he been able to achieve some profound changes in the tenure that he has had?
Well, you said that we were not seen as the representative of the people. They were noticed, they were visible, they were working. But for us, as of today, it is important to have effective prosecution office. And I already told that the functions, the constitutional functions, have changed. Right now, they are not separate, but they are within the law enforcement. They are only investigating and prosecute. So when we're talking about the Prosecutor General, it is a very specific situation, special situation in Ukraine when there was a Prosecutor General who didn't have higher education, and he was appointed to this position. So there were quite a few not very good situations and developments around this issue, but in the end, they said that, I can say that I know our Prosecutor General very well on different positions, and he is ready for uncompromised fight against corruption, specifically after Maidan, and first of all, against the crime associated with the functioning of the previous president of Ukraine, that is Yanukovych and his team. In this regard, I can tell you that there are many critical issues happening. There were quite a few criticisms in his address, in the address of the prosecutor's office, and their cooperation with NABU and special prosecution. There are still some tensions between them, but let us wait a little bit, because right now we can see that a case is sent to court about Yanukovych, about his prosecution and charges. So he's officially charged, and maybe this will be the first case of the Prosecutor General this Prosecutor General who is in his position for less than a year, and that might have been, and we might have had a very good experience by appointing a prosecutor who is outside of the system.
Talk about the civil society component. So, Alexa, you've been working with Ukrainian civil society for many years, not just in Kyiv, but outside of Ukraine, outside of the major cities as well. In many ways, as we already heard, Ukrainian civil society has been the watchdog of the government since the Maidan. But in your view, should civil society demands be even better incorporated into the decision-making process in Ukraine? Minister Jaresko mentioned that it's really Ukrainian civil society that's driving the reforms in Ukraine today. Do you think that is true? And if so, what else can be done to better incorporate their demands?
Thank you for this question, Alina, and to the Atlantic Council for organizing and hosting today's event. I'd like to preface my response to your question by taking a step back and looking at the big picture. Ukraine has been tasked with not only building a new system and new institutions, as we did here in the US over 200 years ago, but additionally, simultaneously, they are having to destroy the old entrenched system. And these reforms really only took off 3 years ago. So at a time when rapid change has been required, civil society has substantively augmented the work of government, working as catalysts, as idea generators, as with Prozoro, aiding in implementation in some cases, and or serving as watchdog, as you rightly said, Alina. Ukraine did not have the time for modernization of the kind that Western societies went through, one in which new values appeared gradually over time. It had to create its own new model of development, which finally picked up speed when a critical mass of these people with these new shared values came to the fore with Maidan. So given this context, to answer your question, Alina, should civil society demands be better incorporated into the decision-making process? I would argue that civil society itself is mandating that it be involved in the process, not only involved, but in fact, taking a leading role. Ukraine, as we know, it arguably has the strongest civil society in the entire region. And some of the most talented alums from Ukrainian civil society are now some of the most talented and respected and trusted lawmakers. For example, Ivanka Klimpush, Hanna Hopko, Svetlana Zalishchuk, all women, by the way. I notice I just named all women. There's a very strong cadre of women in parliament, but there needs to be more. And they all came from civil society. So in that sense, very organically, to answer your original question, civil society's demands and their priorities have, to a certain degree, infiltrated, and I use that word in the best possible sense, infiltrated the decision-making process when it comes to reforms in Parliament. People like them were not in Parliament 3 years ago, and that in and of itself is a great leap forward. So finally, 3 years of Ukrainian reforms prove that when we all work together as a team to have a sandwich effect, international partners, civil society, government, reforms work. We here in Washington need to keep supporting Ukraine, continue the vigilance about reforms. In the past 3 years, Ukraine has achieved more than in the previous 23 years. So reforms only work with this model, and it's a critical moment to protect the achievements to date.
Thank you, Alexa. I want to ask you about some bright spots, as you could say, in Ukrainian civil society. I mean, what you're describing, I think, is an interesting situation. In my view, I tend to agree with you that the government almost has no choice, after the Maidan especially. They have to listen to civil society demands or face the potential consequences of not listening. But before I get there, you mentioned the sandwich model, which we hear about a lot from Ukrainian civil society. Basically, this idea that you need external pressure from the top, particularly from Western governments, as well as bottom-up pressure of society to make sure that the government does the right thing, basically. But one question for you. So, do you think that without that top pressure, there's enough robustness, enough momentum from the bottom up to maintain the, I think, very ambitious reform agenda that Ukraine has set out for itself? This is a hypothetical situation. I'm not saying that Western pressure is going away, but what is your take on that?
I think that at this point, there is enough momentum to the degree that if it were to stop, Ukrainian civil society would not allow it. And if I may, I'd like to give some concrete examples of this civil society that's thriving in connection with, for example, decentralization reform, with e-declaration reform, with the NABU creation, NABU, the Anti-Corruption Bureau. One shining example is Chesna. Chesna is a Kiev-based NGO. Chesna means honest or honestly, but really its work is substantively in the regions. They are very local. Their main mission is to promote key shifts toward transparency and accountability in politics, making elected officials accountable, and conversely, teaching people how to use their local officials. In one project, they gathered and analyzed information about local councilors, and out of 3,000 local politicians analyzed, they found that 1,300 of them were skippers. Skipper is defined as someone who attends no more than 35% of the sessions. Over 80% of these people failed to become councilors again. Chesna's campaign, this kind of shame and blame campaign, as I'll call it, contributed to their unwillingness to either run again or to their loss. Another impressive Chesna campaign was called Follow the Money, and it answered the following key questions. What have local representatives done? How much have they earned? How much have the candidates spent on their campaigns? Why do we elect local representatives, and what do we do with them after the elections? For example, in following how politicians reported their income and expenditures, Chesna created an app which photo captures billboards across the country, geolocates them, and confirms whether parties or candidates are reporting, per law, their expenditures. So people distrust parties in part because they don't understand how parties obtain and use their resources. So this campaign helped to explain to people how money is used, and it in turn created more trust and accountability, and it produced an unprecedented level of dialogue locally. Chesna didn't want to stop their work with the campaigns. They also helped explain kind of the post-election paradigm, and they trained citizens in how to utilize these local elected officials. In connection with decentralization reform and e-declaration reform, Chesna is helping local activists to dig into local politicians' e-declarations, which are then, of course, announced in the media and have all the associated runoff effects. Chesna estimates that their reach of all of their campaigns combined in 1 year was 15 million across 23 oblasts of Ukraine, excepting Luhansk. And I'd like to add, Chesna even pushed back at one point on one of its own compatriots and co-founders, actually. She's now a member of parliament, and about her e-declaration. And they essentially forced her to explain how she had made a mistake in her e-declaration in connection with how she acquired her apartment. So their work is not selectively applied. They hold the same standard across the board, and this action demonstrated that there's no favoritism.
Thanks, Alexis. That's an excellent example, I think, also of how civil society has been working across Ukraine and outside of Kiev to make sure that people feel more connected to their local governments and understand how money is spent and where it comes from. Ukrainians, I think, if anything, they're certainly ingenious when it comes to figuring out how to marry technology and politics. Of course, the Maidan was an example of that. So thank you. We'll come back to the civil society question. I think there's many more bright spots that we could talk about. But I want to give Pavlo the opportunity to discuss current politics. You're, after all, the deputy head of the People's Front Party's political council. So I want to ask you about current Ukrainian politics a bit. Some in Ukraine today, saying they're disappointed with the pace of reforms, are calling for early elections, parliamentary elections. In your view, is this the right tactic to be pursuing at this moment?
Thank you very much for your answer. In order for me to answer this question correctly, I would like to refer to the presentation of Jaresko and Yakemenko, who mentioned that the reforms implemented in Ukraine last year was actually a very bitter pill rather than a candy for Ukrainians. And again, there were some painful processes in banking banking system. They led to some critical belief in future, and but at the same time it was the basis for our future development, for the development of Ukrainian economy and state institutions. But let's evaluate where should this progress move forward to. We looked at the IMF report that was given with regard of the allocation of another tranche of money, and they said that key reforms that have to be implemented in Ukraine in the nearest future is the land reform, that is privatization of land, and pension reform. That would be one of the most important part, which will also increase the pension age, retirement age actually. And these reforms might lead to some kind of resistance, not only in the parliament but also in the society of Ukraine. We have no doubts that there is no guarantee for the implementation of these reforms, but let's ask ourselves the following question. Early elections or even election, will that lead to bringing to the parliament, to the power of those people who will be able to do it? Current government with Groisman and the previous government with Yatsenyuk actually used all of their political mandate to implement reform. Are they going to be able to find those people who can come after them and actually continue these reforms? I personally believe that probably not. Going back to the issue of the support of the Western candidate that supports reforms in Ukraine, Alexa mentioned that a very important component of the cooperation between West and Ukraine is a pressure on the government in order for the government to continue its reforms. Right now, I have a feeling that this pressure is of course, a very effective measure, but we have to be very careful with this tool because we can end up in the situation that the government that implemented reform will not be able to find those who will come after them to continue those reforms, because civil society is very important, and they will find those people who come after this government, and there will be another criticism. And if we have a new parliament, who will come to the new parliament? We can see that the political forces, populists, will come to the parliament, to the government, to the parliament, and they probably will not be able to continue the reform, and they are not the supporters of reforms. At the same time, we still have some chances, maybe not to do the maximum, but somehow affect and impact the situation in Ukraine. We talk a lot about Nabu. Let's see what kind of cases are investigated by Nabu, mostly state enterprises. But if during the next year we privatize all state-owned companies, maybe then we will have a less favorable situation about Nabu, and the situation will improve in general. And those who affect Ukraine, who have influence on politicians in Ukraine, I would ask you to support Ukraine and have long-term impact, and not support those who call for early election, quick change in the policy, and ask those politicians, what is your positive program? What is the essence of your program before they push for the change?
Of the Parliament in passing some key reforms. You already mentioned quite a few here on the panel. NABU is a separate issue, but e-declaration, e-procurement. Of course, we've also had a massive restructuring of the tax code, of the energy sector. Of course, Minister Jaresko was responsible for a lot of those reforms. But what have been some of the perhaps more less known reforms that you can point to that the Parliament has been able to pass that you could tell us about that maybe we don't have a lot of media coverage of here in the West?
Дійсно, дуже велика увага приділяється.
It is true. The anti-corruption reform is very important, and many people pay attention to this reform. But I believe also that there are more important things that are not as noticeable, and they might be less understandable. Let us say about changes in the energy sector, gas and energy resources. We have prepared the draft new law about the energy market that is in line with European standards about transportation and delivery of gas. This is a very good example how reforms work in Ukraine. Last week, the National Commission of Regulation of Energy passed a resolution to pay for billing for everybody. Payment for billing exists in many countries for hooking up to the networks. So the negative opinion of public was very, very strong, even though that was our requirement, the IMF requirement before us. In that case, both President and the government went to Commission to either repeal this decision or change it. For me, this is the biggest problem. What can be done in this area in order for the government to do what it has to do and maybe take upon unpopular reform? They probably have to have some kind of easier situation in other areas. 5% of GDP is spent for defense. For Ukraine, it's a huge amount, about 130 billion hryvnias per annual. This is about $8 million. This is a big amount. It is very hard for us to use because we use some money that we received from IMF. And all tranches of IMF that were provided to Ukraine for our balance deficit can be actually be done by one defense budget of Ukraine. It is very hard for a country that spends so much money for the defense and for the fight against external enemy, fight at the same time its internal opposition that tells people that they know better what reforms are about and how the reforms should be implemented.
So I want to ask maybe one question of the entire panel before I turn it over to the audience. We've been having the conversation focused on anti-corruption. In your view, and I'd like all of you to think about this answer, what would be the top concrete reform that still needs to happen that you think would be a strong signal that Ukraine is on the right path when it comes to fighting corruption? Who would like to start? I can just pick some. We did start with you, Yuri. So would you like to start us off?
I think that if we exemplify the fighting of corruption as a most important sign of progress of reforms in Ukraine, I think we have to create the complete circle of this system. We have to bridge all the gaps that exist within this system. And we have to construct the completely coherent system from the very beginning to the end. So starting with the Anti-Corruption Bureau, and then Prosecutor's Office, and then we step by step come into judiciary system. And it's directly linked to the reform of judiciary system, and then we have this complete mechanism of how to guarantee that any corruptionist couldn't avoid a penalty for his deeds, and in the same time you have to guarantee the principle of rule of law will be kept in Ukraine, and the principle of presumption of innocence as well.
So just to very concretely, if you want, you mentioned the reform of the judiciary, which
Yes.
we haven't talked about. What would be a concrete reform that would give confidence to the fact that the Ukrainian government is motivated to make sure the judges are autonomous and independent and are free from special interests?
I think Viktor Lawrentievich knows better.
Fair enough. But I might come back to you because I want a concrete reform, a very clear step. So, Viktor, would you like to answer that question?
You know, the way you ask the question is somewhat, let's, what kind of reform we can do to deal with it, to address it. There is no such situation, as Yuri said, I agree with him, this is a systematic, comprehensive approach. This is a disease in the government, and we have to have systematic approach to it. For example, when the decision is made, the president issues his order, then there are laws, then there are various resolutions, etc., etc. And then when the laws are changed, then probably some other regulations are passed, and then that's when the corruption enters, and it is very hard to find those corrupt actions there. So I believe that if President, Cabinet, and Parliament will do very important steps to make sure that there is no corruption options or corruptions on any of these stages of their activities, I believe that we have to deal with courts first. I do not believe, I'm not saying that we need to create an anti-corruption court. In Ukraine it says the highest anti-corruption court. I don't believe that it's important. It's important to have a system, maybe specialized judges who are specializing in the area of corruption, and they would look into those cases, and those cases would go up to the highest court. And that's when NABU can be exemplary, that they deal with all of the corruption from the beginning to the end to the decision of the court.
I take your points, both of your points, that there needs to be a systemic effort, but at the same time, systemic efforts don't just come out of the blue. You need small steps to get there. And, I think some of the issues that we face sometimes in Washington, we have these kinds of discussions, is that we get very little of those small concrete steps. But Alexa, I saw you had your hand up, so maybe you can fill us in.
If I may, I'll take a little bit of liberty with this question, and instead of naming a specific actual concrete reform, I'd like to suggest a mechanism, a tool for implementing reforms going forward, and that would be, I'd like to address this question of talent. Ukraine has talent that I would argue is not being utilized as much as it should be. An example that comes to mind is post-Euromaidan, a group of young professionals in their 20s and 30s who had all received Western educations. They came together and created PGI, Professional Government Initiative, which is now the Professional Government Association, PGA. These are motivated, ambitious patriots who've received Western educations and have come back to their country because they want to affect change. Their key assumptions when they formed this group was that, one, the government is interested in getting professionals to join, and two, the government prefers and will prioritize hiring professionals with an international education. They had a promising early run in the euphoria of the post-Maidan days. I think about 50 of them were placed into executive and legislative branches. But soon after, that momentum stalled. And many PGI placements have, in fact, left the government, just citing kind of sabotage in some cases and fatigue. So my request for reform would be to use these motivated young professionals to affect change. And this group, there's now several thousands of them in this association. they haven't become demotivated. In fact, going forward, amongst their priorities, they plan to, one, fight to change salaries to market levels in order to allow these professionals to stay in government and work for a minimum of 2 to 3 years. And also they want to build awareness that well-paid, accountable professionals are a key to success. I should highlight, we're here in Washington, we have a shining example of a PGA profile working here at the Embassy of Ukraine, actually, Oksana Shuler. She's not here today, but we need more people like Oksana working in decision-making and influential positions. Another piece of the bigger puzzle, I think, and it's an important one to bring up. Thank you. And Pavlo, last word to you.
Maybe I will not be within the mainstream. If we need to identify one step that would be decisive for the future is privatization. I believe that we need to privatize state-owned property. Of course, it will not deal with all of the current economic issues to provide the money to the budget. We are talking about the value of assets. The value of assets dropped so much. The privatization price is very low, so money will not be made on it, and the money in budget will not come in. But talking about this as a driver of change, yes, the changes will come fast. Corruption exists where there is something that they can steal. When you are a private owner, you will steal from yourself.
To open up to the audience, so there'll be microphones going around. Please wait for the mic. Please introduce yourself and please ask a question and refrain from making long commentary. Adrian, please. It's coming.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's not on.
Anyway, speak loud.
All right. Anyway, I want to continue the interesting topic that Alexa raised, which is recruiting reformers and high-level talent. And I think we have a bit of a disbalance in how Western aid policy is structured. And the greatest complaint now of reformers inside government is precisely the idea that wages are not of the kind that can sustain people who have capacity. And so when we see the failures of the procuracy, and we think that until the beginning of this year they were making $200 a month as their base salary, it's now between $400 and $700, you can understand why it's very hard to recruit talented prosecutors. And prosecutorial cases may fail not because of corruption, but or someone bribing a prosecutor, but simply because talented people are not able to gather evidence, convey evidence, and move it forward. The same thing in the judiciary, where low wages were also a factor in corruption. So in my question is how can one structure and reconfigure the aid package that would enable more of the talent that is resident in civil society to move into the state sector, because you can't create a two-tiered structure. At the moment, the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Economy are handling this by having, say, 100 people that are paid by the European Union funds as consultants, but they don't actually have full ministerial or sub-ministerial rights. And I think that's another problem. So I want to ask the legislator, is there anything that can be done in Ukrainian legislation that can enable, if not a two-tiered, but some kind of an accommodation to have higher wages for key personnel in ministries that would attract the best talent? And secondly, is there anything in the way that the West can structure its aid package to put more money to bring civil society not against the state, but into the state to propel reforms from within?
Alexa, do you want to start then, Pavlo, perhaps? Yeah.
After me. Насправді в Україні прийнятий закон про
There is a new legislation about government service. And it indicated the way how the salary should be paid to the. And the salary of the government officials, and you know that government officials is a quite conservative system, government service, which implies certain career growth and the corresponding salary. We had experiments in our area to bring in foreigners into our government, and their salary was paid, as far as I know, at the same level as to Ukrainian officials, and they were working basically for the idea, but the experiment has shown that there is nothing better than the systematic work. Therefore, to raise the level for the government officials, one should do it all throughout the whole system. One could identify the most talented or capable. It is impossible right now. From the political point of view, any initiatives related to the raising salary to the government officials is perceived by the society extremely negatively. That causes a tremendous protest and negative reaction from the society. And the third is if we are going to manage to reach the minimal raise of the government official salaries, and within the procedures which we are already prescribed by the language of our legislation, we have competition where we can select talented people, both with the Western background and the people from inside Ukraine who could improve the quality of work.
I'm not a legislator.
I'm
curious to hear these thoughts. I don't have the answer, but I agree with you, Adrian. Currently, NGOs are often able to attract the higher caliber of talent than the government because of Western donor funds. And sometimes the more capable professionals are, in fact, investigating the government than are in the government. So I agree with you that it should be a priority to figure out a way to change this system. Victor, did you want to respond as well?
Yes, I'd like to say that the salaries of judges' salaries, this is already taken into account into the reform of the judicial system. What could be salary of the judges? What is the minimal salary of the judges? And I should tell you that that not all citizens read the legislation. So it is very unsafe to provide this information to the public opinion. Let's say the judge on the level of the first level, he has from $1,500 to $2,000 salary per month, while a court of appeal is $3,000-4,000, while the Supreme Court is from $6,000 to $8,000, or even more. It depends on the experience. Sometimes it go up to $230,000. It could be a monthly salary. I'm not talking annual salary. And for example, it bothers me a lot, extremely, that the Constitutional Court in Ukraine has played a very negative role in establishment of the Yanukovych's dictature. It made a decision following which violated the constitution, which gave the opportunity for Yanukovych to become president in 2010. So the law on the Constitutional Court, which tomorrow might be already become, the draft might be the legislation, said, while we're talking right now, the rather might be voting already, so all this amount of money should be multiplied by 1.5. You can imagine, and I was looking at the one of the experts gave me this, showed me that up to 2 years, a judge from the Constitutional Court, when they are elected for 5 years, 2 years of 180 200,000 hryvnias, that's about $7,000-8,000. And by the end, by the ninth year, it goes up to $14,000 dollars per month. For what? For they taking anti-constitutional decisions, and the judges who are there, they made the anti-constitutional decision and basically organized the coup d'etat setup. Therefore, there is also a political factor, and I believe that this is a completely different area of our conversation. But this salaries, it's already an issue which is strongly debated and is considered. Так, пожалуйста.
My name's Paul Thomas.
Меня
I've
зовут
been
Пол Томас,
owning and
я
operating several businesses in Ukraine for 25 years. I want to follow up and ask for further elaboration on the comments. The number one systemic problem in Ukraine, I know this from personal experience dealing with prosecutors, judges, bureaucrats, I don't even want to remember. The problem Ukraine has is that there has been fundamentally zero serious structural reform of the judicial and prosecutorial services. They are answerable effectively, exclusively to the president of Ukraine. NGOs are superb. They cannot force Poroshenko to reform the judiciary and the prosecutorial services. They cannot be reformed from within. The system is designed to operate in an extraordinarily corrupt way. I know this from painful experience. What needs to be done, and only the high-level European governments, America, quite frankly, beating the heck out of the Ukrainian government, are you going to get deep structural reform? They need to be rebuilt structurally and staffed from the bottom up. And until that's done, all these reforms remain extremely fragile. The reference to Yanukovych Constitutional Court. He became president, Constitutional Court changed the Constitution overnight to make him effectively a dictator. This president, or the next one, could eliminate or block every reform that's ever been implemented in Ukraine precisely because of no reform of the prosecutorial or judicial function. So if you could comment on how to do that, not in small steps, we need gigantic steps. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll take before you answer, I'll take another question. Nadia, please.
I don't think all reforms are that complicated. For instance, what is the progress within the Verkhovna Rada to stop people voting for others? To me, that's a very basic form of corruption. And as far as the judicial reforms, there have been some judicial reforms, except they've been blocked once they reach a certain stage. You know, you can go on the internet and see long lists of federal and state officials that have been convicted and are in jail. There is yet to be, I think, one case in Ukraine of significance. And also, I have a curious question. Has there been an effort to investigate the poisoning of one of Ukraine's presidents?
Thank you. I will take one last question before I turn it back to the audience. I see a hand far in the back. I can't tell who it is, but I see a hand.
My name is Bob Homans. I've been living in Ukraine for the past 10 years, and I'm kind of a disinterested observer, I suppose. I attended something last December called the Tiger Conference in Kiev, and there was a panel at that conference on recovering stolen assets. And there was zero optimism at that panel about the prospect of ever recovering any stolen assets. Some of those assets have actually been frozen in Western countries. Has there been any progress? I've heard today about these new agencies, but I was wondering if people feel that there's been a little bit more progress in that area since last December. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have three questions. One about the big steps that could take place for structural reforms that could not be so easily reversed. Question about the investigation around the poisoning of Yushchenko, and the question about asset recovery. So who would like to take a first stab?
If I understood you correctly, regarding the structural reform of the judicial system, we had amendment of the Constitution. The Constitution was changed last year. Regarding the judicial reform, regarding the law enforcement system, and from the point of view of the question which you raised, there is possible opportunities. First of all, officially, literally in the Constitution, there was banned the political influence on the judicial power. Before that, we had this experience that the Supreme Rada appoints the chairman. Now we have a special body which is called Supreme Council of Justice, which also has Supreme Committee on the judicial power, which checks and confirms the candidates to the judicial position, to the jobs of judges, and then transfer it to the Supreme Rada in order to confirm this appointment. And the president only ceremonially, officially, on behalf of the government, confirms appointment of a person to the position of a judge. But there is one little detail which also makes me a little bit concerned, and we have a lot that it's not a secret for you that the judicial power has a tendency for corruption. In other words, the judges and courts are corrupted, and we decided to do as the European Commission has recommended us, and our European colleagues have. We created this Supreme Council of Justice of 21 members, out of whom are 11 judges. And then I raised the question as a member of the Constitutional Committee, who was working on this issue of the change of the Constitution. They also raised the question if we are going to ask. Tell judges that they would not trust them, and then make the majority in this committee. This is already an element of corporative influence. When the judges have this tendency, they might create their own corporation where they are going to make decisions upon their own colleagues. This, in other words, it should be under control, and see how it works, and see how we began to creation of the Supreme Court. We are going to have 200 judges of the Supreme Court. Right now we have only 120, and the competition already began, the bidding system began, and people go there not only for the reason of the salary, because it's extremely prestigious, it's a huge bidding competition of the candidates for this. Yes, I'm wrapping up. I believe that this period we should go through this period. You know why we have all this non-stop issues of things not being completed? Because we do everything at the same time. We try to fix all the judicial reform, all the bodies. We create new positions for the judges, and therefore there is this danger that we need to go step by step. And I believe that civil society should deal with this issue. Thank you.
30-second response to the rest of the panel.
Yes, for the three questions probably all together, because everything is linked with one another. It's a really problem of our expectations and the need of reforms of judiciary and prosecutor's office and law enforcement system at all, and the concrete steps of implementing of those reforms. Before, it's very good approach. It was just after the Maidan was sound that we have to fire all judges and we have to appoint all new judges in their position. But if we go by this way, we for some period didn't have any court working in the Ukraine. It's impossible to admit this situation. The same is with the prosecutor's office. The process of renovation of cadres within the prosecutor's office is very slow, and inertia is very big. And the problem of reformation is very complicated because of different factors, including limitation of other laws. We have to follow within these problems to the principle of rule of law. We can't fire a judge, we have dismissed any prosecutor from his position without some background, without legal background, only by fact of his belonging into this position. So it's another part of this problem. And if we are speaking about, we had to have evidence of his illegal behavior on those positions. So in this process, there are a lot of such obstacles that prevent from reaching a very fast and comprehensive and very good results. We have this process going, but it is going slower than we would like to go, and probably it's not the first and the last problems within this process of reformation.
Thank you. And Alexa, you're passing? I don't have anything substantive to add. Okay.
Були два питання.
There were two questions which were not answered, which is about the voting in the Supreme Court, Supreme Rada of Ukraine, and the heightening the level of political culture. And I'm very glad that lately the interest in the society and among our colleagues to these issues has been lowered. I'm glad that the in order to lower the level of this violence, we don't need to introduce the censor buttons, and I believe that it should be done voluntarily, and it would reflect the raising of political culture of our colleagues. And regarding the assets which was stolen during the Yanukovych time, my understanding is that there is no decisions which by the Ukrainian courts which would demand the international bodies to return these assets, and the General Prosecutor of Ukraine requested the authority in order to conduct the investigations in absence. The Supreme Rada agreed for this possibility, and we are going to provide the General Prosecutor with the authority to conduct in court in absence investigation and raise the issue of return of those assets. Thank you.
We have time. No, we have no time. We have the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State who will be delivering remarks in just 5 minutes. Ms. Bridget Brink, we're absolutely delighted to have her. We're going to take a 5-minute break. So please, very quickly, grab something to drink and come back. And please, before you go, thank the panel along with me for this fascinating discussion.
Please leave all headsets on your chairs. Someone will them shortly. Again, please leave all headsets on your chairs.